Ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, Minister, President, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you warmly at the 2014 General Conference of the European Association of the Development Research and Training Institutes at Gustav Stresemann Institute in Bonn. I'm Patrick Leusch, Head International Cooperation Department of Deutsche Welle Academy. Deutsche Welle is the international broadcaster, big media company in Bonn, and the Deutsche Welle Academy is the media development arm and the leading German media development organization. It's an honor to be host for this morning session, for the welcome addresses, and as well for the first smashing plenary that launches the couple of debates that we will have over the next 4 years. Responsible development in the polycentric world, inequality, citizenship, and the middle class. Punching words, couple of key words, and let's see how they link together. In my view, a very programmatic title, which will lead to a lot of discussions, I hope, and I'm confident. Bonn was Germany's capital town for more than 40 years, and in one regard it is still a capital town. It's still the capital of development cooperation, I think. The main actors, main German actors, but also international actors like UN, with development cooperation departments, organizations are still in Bonn. So it's a good idea to have this conference here in Bonn. And I would like to call on stage Reinhard Limbach, Deputy Mayor of the City of Bonn, for a welcome address. Mr. Limbach, please.
Minister Schwalduren, Professor Baut, Mr. Riemann, Mr. Feinberg, ladies and gentlemen, willkommen, welcome, bienvenue to the 14th EADI conference. I'm very happy to welcome you to the opening of this important conference on behalf of Mayor Jürgen Nimtsch. My name is Reinhard Limbach, and it was only yesterday that I was elected as Deputy Mayor by the City Council. Thank you. The City of Bonn is proud to have partnered up with the European Association of Development Research and Training Institutes in 2014 on the special occasion of EADI's 40th anniversary. In the year 2014, we find ourselves in challenging times. 2014 is the year of a heated debate over new sustainable development goals, as we are less than a year away from the desired fulfillment of the Millennium Development Goals in 2015. The year 2014 is also the year of goals that have been set in another context. The FIFA World Cup in Brazil unites people in their passion for soccer around the globe. But let us come back to our passion for sustainability and to the goals for the next 2 days. The goals of evaluating, debating, and combating inequality. The conference theme, Responsible Development in a Polycentric World, Inequality, Citizenship, and the Middle Classes, picks up several of the ongoing processes. It addresses social inequality and highlights the multiple processes in the modern societies leading to a new social structure and emerging middle classes. This debate is of high interest from a development perspective, while understanding development in an inclusive way. Development means moving towards a global, sustainable future by rethinking our status quo. Responsible and responsive citizenship are indispensable pillars on which sustainable societies all over the world can be built. I would like to thank EADI for offering a fantastic platform for this interesting and important debate. Again, this annual partnership showcases a brilliant example of the amazing diversity of resident organizations in Bonn. The common focus in all of our partnerships is on sustainability in a wider perception. And with EADI, it's on equality with all its related aspects. I'm sorry. You may have heard that the city of Bonn is said to have a certain atmosphere that has been recognized by Bonn-based actors and organizations, a certain spirit favorable to exchange, cooperation, and networking. This so-called Bonn spirit has already contributed to many successful conferences in Bonn, and I'm quite sure that it will be also prove beneficial to your conference. In times of globalization and polycentralization, it's more important than ever to think about the right orientation and to discuss some core values. And I strongly believe in the power of people, of citizens, as the ones who give the first and to implement the last. I would like to thank EADI for having convened this conference and for following up on these important questions. I'm sure you will have a very interesting exchange over the next 2 days and that your joint debates will send out a strong signal to other forums all over the world. Sustainability needs fresh thinking and scientific backing. EADI provides both. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Limbach. It's a special honor to have Dr. Angelika Schwalduren with us. She is Minister for Federal Affairs, Europe and the Media of the Federal State of North Rhine-Westphalia. And in that regard, linking development and media, which is particularly important to us. Dr. Schwalduren, please, the floor is yours.
Dear Mayor Limbach, dear Dr. Femberg, dear Professor Baut, I'm very pleased to welcome you in the name of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia in Bonn. Mayor Limbach has already highlighted the significance and growing prominence of Bonn as Germany's UN city and sustainability hub. Let me add from our perspective as state government. We are very proud that with Bonn and the international organizations located here, we have a tremendous treasure and diversity of international expertise on many of the global questions that drive the international agenda today. EADI is a very important actor in the field and has over the years been a very committed member of the Bonn International NGO community. On the occasion of this year's General Conference, EADI has put together an impressive program and gathered an impressive group of international experts on a very interesting issue, development and the role of the middle classes. Ladies and gentlemen, any discussion on the prospects of world economic development is likely to be a debate about whether the glass is half empty or half full. For the economists at Goldman Sachs, the glass is at least half full. They insist that in spite of the continued volatility of the markets and the financial sector, we will see more people around the world going to work, buying things, more and more things, and generously creating economic activity. The unprecedented growth of the middle class is driving a continuing demand for products and services and an increase in the brain power that produces them. Most importantly, the growth of the middle class is significant first and foremost because it has resulted in a dramatic march of millions of people out of poverty. The International Monetary Fund highlights the growth in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, of 6.5% and 5% last year as being particularly dynamic. The rise on the middle class in this region is against this backdrop an encouraging sign of monumental change. A more careful assessment of the world economy may still conclude that the glass is half empty. Mrs. Lagarde, Managing Director of the IMF, reminds us that global growth is still stuck in low gear, that it is too low, too fragile, too uneven, and is being enjoyed by too few people. I would tend to agree that in spite of the progress made, the kind of economic and social mobility that a life in the middle classes promises, while becoming a reality for many, is still a distant dream for millions of people across the globe. Whatever our position on that divide, most of us will agree that the middle class, however defined, is a force to be reckoned with in any program for social, political, and economic transformation. The complex development of the middle class in emerging economies is a very interesting and highly relevant issue in this context. It is therefore surprising that, as the organizers have pointed out, the situation of the middle class in emerging economies has until recently not figured prominently on the international development agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, the emerging post-2015 agenda is the global framework for the ongoing debate on sustainable development. Poverty reduction, changing global consumption patterns, the future of employment and the transformation of global labor markets should all figure prominently in this debate. All of these issues are key to any discussion on the middle classes in our contemporary societies and the role they play in the development agenda. I am pleased to note that many of these questions are being addressed here. We are organizing an international conference on the post-2015 agenda with the GIZ, Germany's largest agency for international cooperation. It will provide a further interesting platform from which to support, inform, and strengthen the global development process. The event is the Bonn Conference for Global Transformation and will take place here in Bonn in the spring of 2015. I would be very happy to welcome you there. The input of the research community represented by many of you here today would be an invaluable contribution to this forum. I would like to close by thanking EADI for organizing today's event and providing us with an excellent opportunity for a much-needed conversation on the potential and challenges of responsible development. I wish all of you a successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Sure, the German Minister for Economic Development Cooperation sits most of his time in Berlin, where the government is sitting. Nevertheless, most of the departments and most of the stuff and the real work is probably done more in Bonn. And that's why we have a representative of the BMZ, Bundesministerium für wirtschaftliche Zusammenarbeit und Entwicklung, Dr. Bernhard Fellenberg. Please, your welcome address.
Dear Professor Bord, dear Mrs. Schwal-Düren, dear Mr. Limbach, distinguished guests, dear friends and colleagues, On behalf of Federal Minister Dr. Gerd Müller and of the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development as a whole, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you to the 14th EADI General Conference here in the federal city of Bonn. This impressive gathering of scientists, political practitioners and committed members of the civil society marks the 50th anniversary of the European Association of Development and Research Training Institutes. During the past 4 decades, EADI has contributed to the formulation of a united European voice, no less decisively than to the implementation of a united European agenda in development cooperation. This is a merit of the pioneer work of your presently 150 member organizations, of your 220 individual members, as well as of your lean but efficient General Secretariat, which we have been glad and proud to host in Bonn since the year 2000. While the European Union has often been said to punch well below its weight, EADI can rightfully claim to have paved the way for addressing and overcoming this long-standing deficiency, at least in the field of development cooperation. This fact alone leads me to say that all the support that the German federal government has provided to EADI through BMZ has continuously turned out to deliver an excellent return on investment. From past experiences, I would dare to say that there is no single issue related to development cooperation for which EADI would not be able to provide, through its unique data bank and related services, tailor-made in-depth background for BMZ and other development ministries and agencies with 1 hour of working time. Your research work is not l'art pour l'art, but strictly consumer and application oriented. This is what we need. My congratulations. EADI would not be EADI if you had dedicated the coming days merely for celebrating your anniversary in line with your unique track record of past successes. Instead, you have identified an extremely rich and substantial conference agenda, which is at the same time highly relevant to all development practitioners inside and outside of BMZ. I'm not surprised, therefore, to see many of my colleagues among the audience when I tell you that some of them are not easy to distract from their working places. This might serve you as an indicator of the impact and relevance of your conference program. During the next 3 days, your discussions will be focusing on the most urgent questions of the current development debate. How can economic growth be managed more responsibly? How can we tackle economic and social inequality and environmental problems at the same time? And what is the role of the rising middle class in emerging economies within this process of responsible development? We consider economic growth as one of the most critical drivers to eradicate poverty, to create jobs and sources of income. But economic growth does not automatically lead to overall positive effects. It often promotes unsustainable consumption and production habits, intensifies resource depletion and increases inequality and social exclusion. We are therefore convinced that economic growth must be shaped differently in the future. We consequently must focus our attention on the qualitative aspects of economic growth and ensure that economic growth is people-centered and planet-sensitive at the same time. Only growth strategies that balance the social, environmental, and economic dimension can be sustained. In the negotiation rounds of the new post-2015 development agenda, Germany therefore strongly promotes the role of green and inclusive growth and the role of the private sector as the key drivers to reduce poverty and achieve sustainable development. But what we still need is a strong social consensus of how to operate sustainably and responsibly in the future. In Germany, we have therefore initiated the Charter of the Future, One World, Our Responsibility, in which we foster an intense dialogue between the state, the private sector, civil society organizations and the scientific community to develop concrete means of implementation and strong partnership for the post-2015 agenda. Through this involvement of relevant stakeholders, we want to highlight our common responsibility for a more socially inclusive, environmentally friendly and secure world. But to come back to the topic of this conference, green and inclusive growth can only be achieved through a transformation of unsustainable production and consumption patterns. It is now your turn to discuss which impact the strong purchasing power of the rising middle class in emerging countries might have on the environment and how they will influence development priorities in the future. But before releasing you to the first plenary session of this morning, let me again express my sincere appreciation to the host of this event, the European Association of Development Research and Training Institutes. I also want to thank all the participants of this conference. We strongly appreciate your expertise and input, which is urgently needed in setting a new sustainable development agenda beyond 2015. Thank you for your attention and best of success for the pursuit of this conference.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fernberg, for your kind words. And now I would like to call on stage your host, the president of EADI, Isa Bout, for the welcome address and a kind of introduction in a co-session with a co-president, Dr. Jürgen Wiemann. So, Isa Bout, please.
Deputy Mayor Limbach, Dr. Schwalduren, who's unfortunately just had to leave us, Dr. Fernberg, ladies and gentlemen, EADI members and friends. It gives me great pleasure indeed to welcome you this morning to the 14th conference, EADI conference, in which we're taking up a number of major issues, which I will come to shortly. I would like to say a little bit about EADI. Some of the earlier speakers have already alluded to EADI. Indeed, I think we're a rather unique association, bringing together 150 institutes within Europe, but with a perspective on the rest of the world. Universities, research institutes, think tanks, civil society organizations, funding agencies, individual members. We bring together a very diverse epistemic community. And I think that is our power, our strength in having already existed, survived for 40 years. An important part of that survival has been the long-standing relationships which we've built up in the last 14 years with Bonn and the institutions located in Bonn. And the first, let me name, is the long-standing relationship with the German Federal Ministry for economic cooperation and development. Your unflagging cooperation and support to EADI as a membership organization has been very strategic for us in promoting our activities and being able to go from strength to strength. Secondly, to the government of North Rhine-Westphalia, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. That added support has been very strategic for us to expand our activities in new areas over these past 14 years, and we look forward very much to our continued cooperation. Finally, but not least, with the city of Bonn, with whom this year we have a special partnership, which means that we are developing a whole program together of activities in which the relationship between the city, the perspective, the very international perspective of the city and that of EADI is brought to the fore. And we hope to conclude that with a special program this fall. Then, the EADI membership itself. Earlier it was already said, the organization of this conference, we've taken a different way of doing that. We have made a combination both of, say, the organization as such, the support from donors, but also taken a modern perspective on this by doing what we call co-production, co-organizing. So I would like to thank not only the Secretariat, who has indeed done an absolute marvelous job of organizing this conference, in which we have more participants than ever. More than 550 people have registered for this conference. But also all of those here in the room and behind the scenes who have helped organize sessions, panels, and basically brought together a very diverse and a very interesting program. More so, I dare to say, than any of the previous conferences. So that indeed is a very large, very great compliment to the creativity that we embody as EADI. Let me talk briefly about the theme of our conference, responsible development in a polycentric world, with a focus specifically on the emerging middle class. This theme reflects several central shifts in thinking on development processes which are quite strategic towards the future. The focus on the polycentric world reflects a reality in which new development models are emerging from the initiative of various countries in the South, and I'm thinking particularly of the BRICS countries. One particularly notable example is Brazil, which has shown the world that social policies can be introduced in countries which are still growing and have very large levels of inequalities. By introducing such social policies, these have had measurable effects on reducing inequalities in income and improving outcomes in household livelihoods. This shift is also reflected in the aid architecture, in which new donors are taking a much more prominent role in working in development cooperation. What the emerging middle class in the countries of the Global South will do in terms of building new forms of citizenship and exercising them is a globally important question. This concerns not only the lifestyle of the middle class, its size, although these are important. It concerns much more the ways in which the middle class will engage with existing inequalities in their own countries and in other countries across the world. This requires initiatives to improve the quality of government and governance and developing effective forms of citizenship and accountability. It also implies more polycentric forms of collaboration across the countries of the world so that we strategically influence trends for a future world that will be more resilient to, for instance, issues of climate change, in which conflicts are reduced and poverty is no longer acceptable. In bringing together speakers from the various regions in this panel, we are providing a platform for a variety of voices which need to be heard in the European context, where discussions about the role that European countries individually and the EU as a whole are strongly debated. We look forward to our discussions on these issues in the coming days here and our panel at this moment. I would like to conclude by giving the floor to Jürgen Wiemann, addressing to him two questions which have informed our discussions until now in organizing this conference, particularly around our theme. So the first question is, Jürgen, what do we mean by responsible development, and how have we discussed this?
Thank you, Isa. Let me first start by saying that when I listened to the speeches this morning by the mayor and by the minister and by the representative of the BMZ, my feeling is that our theme doesn't need much explanation. It has been absorbed by the institutions that are behind us. So that is a good sign. When we started to reflect about the theme for the next General Conference, that was about a year ago in Prague, I think, we had the discussion on should we, in the year 2014, 1 year ahead of 2015, should we talk about MDGs, SDGs and all that. But after some time, we realized that we are not a UN body, and it's not our task to add another target or another set of targets to these UN agendas, but our task as a scientific association is, if I may say so, to dig a little bit more deep, to look behind the curtain, to see what trends can be seen in our countries, in the regions that are represented here, what challenges are coming up there, and then from that take some conclusions on the agenda and is it realistic and so on. So when we took up this responsible development, we had the impression we have to look at the middle classes on both sides, so to say, on the side of the developing world, but also on the middle classes of the developed world. And possibly we are overcharging us, the middle classes, and we scientists are middle class of Europe and of the OECD world, that we feel we are responsible. This may not be true, but we have the feeling at least that we should come together, the middle classes and the representatives of our countries, with the representatives of the middle class of the emerging countries, and look on common ground, look on common responsibility. And there are two themes that we feel are important, and that the one theme is inequality. I think the middle classes on both sides have this problem of rising inequality in their countries. And even if we have the feeling maybe the rising middle classes and maybe the middle classes under pressure in the OECD world have a conflict of interest, the one is going up, the other is going down, we want to emphasize that we may have a common ground and a common interest, and that is inequality. How do we perceive inequality, and what ideas, what concepts do we have to combat inequality? And the second area of responsibility, that is very clear, that is the green agenda. Responsibility for the spaceship Earth. And of course we have the feeling with the rising purchasing power of the emerging middle classes, there could be a problem for the global environment, for climate change. And
There's not could be a problem, there is a problem.
there is a problem.
Which is related to us.
Can the new middle classes, the rising middle classes, copy our lifestyles as we have them? We are talking about our lifestyles. Do we have to change them? Do we have to think about mobility by cars and others? And can we again share what we think is needed, what we do not really translate into everyday action, but can we at least discuss with the representatives of the middle classes of the emerging countries about how to share the responsibility for our system.
And I think the final issue is indeed what we have here, citizenship. The changes in citizenship, the character of citizenship, and how this is developed. I think that is a global discussion that we need to engage in very strategically in this period with very great urgency. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isa.
So, thank you very much, Professor Bout and Dr. Riemann. Now let's come to the first panel discussion. This morning we will tackle the general topic of the conference with a sentence that is entitled for the panel, Middle Class as a Development Actors in a Polycentric World. Middle class as a development actors in a polycentric world, and you may have noticed there is no question mark behind it. So it's said as a fact. Let's see if we all agree. Do you agree fully? Do you agree partly? You disagree at all to the fact that middle class is a development actor in a polycentric world. So show me your thumbs. You fully agree, you partly agree, you disagree. Okay, most of you agree more or less. Would it be wise to put a question mark behind it? Who agrees that it would be wise at that stage of knowledge we have to put a question mark behind it? Show me your hand. Okay. So, that is a very good starting point for a lively debate. So, let me present to you your panel. I would like to welcome Dr. Nolene Heiser of Singapore. She is the Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and current Executive Secretary of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. And she is the former head of the United Nations Development Fund for Women. Dr. Nolene Heiser, welcome. Her vision is of a more resilient Asia-Pacific founded in social equity and shared prosperity, empowered by the creativity of its people and valuing the gifts of the planet. That's what she said. Let's look deeper into that. I would like to call on stage Dr. Chen Shen. He holds the named professorship William Borah Distinguished Professor of Political Science and serves as a Dean of the College of Graduate Studies of the University of Idaho. Welcome, Professor Chen. You can see the other side with you. He's at the same time, he holds a couple of professorships in Chinese universities. And he has authored or co-authored 6 books about Chinese politics and U.S. foreign affairs. His most recent and forthcoming books include Popular Political Support in Urban China, and he says the middle class does not necessarily support democratization in authoritarian developing countries. Also an interesting insight that we have to elaborate further. Thank you for being with us. I would like to introduce to you Dr. Ashok Desai. He comes from the country with probably the fastest growing middle class, India. Welcome, Dr. Desai. He is a consultant editor of the Telegraph, and he was chief consultant in the finance ministry of India from 91 to 93, and he helped to design the early economic reforms in India. And there is an interesting detail about him, because he graduated PhD in economics from Cambridge in '63 for his dissertation on German economic growth before World War I. And I'm not mentioning now the 100-year celebrations of World War I, but maybe we can look into history, what can we learn from the development of middle classes in Europe, exactly the point that Dr. Wiemann mentioned. I would like to introduce to you Luis López Calva, who is the lead economist and regional poverty advisor in the Europe and Central Asia region at the World Bank. Welcome on stage. He served also as a chief economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at UNDP in New York from 2007 to 2010. And we should congratulate for the qualification of Mexico for the... Right. Congrats for Mexico. I don't know if you have followed football yesterday. I wasn't sure about that joke in a very, academic environment, but you never know. Last but not least, I would like to introduce to you Bright Simmons. He is a recipient of numerous awards ranging from the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Award, the Marie Curie and Commonwealth Vision Grants, and he is consulted on innovation strategy by international organizers such as World Bank and USAID and the Commonwealth. He is the president of the MDGs network, where he pioneered a system that allows consumers to instantly check whether their medicines are counterfeits or not by sending a free text message. And that system is only one innovation that he has done. And it is applied in many countries in the meanwhile, not only in Ghana, where he comes from. Welcome at the General Conference. So, now we have completed the panel, but the panel is not complete without expert audience. This is you, and as in general, in this kind of panels, there will be a Q&A session later when we have kept forward a little bit the discussion on the podium. Then it's your turn. Nevertheless, we have decided to give you a second communication channel which you can use from now, and it's written also on the slide. If you have an internet access, so use the hashtag GC2014P1. And give us your comments or questions. I will check them regularly during the discussion, and I may introduce a question or remarks you made in the discussion while we have it on the podium. So don't wait for your question, then don't make big lists of questions you will have at the end of the session. Simply send a message. I think most of you have internet access because there is a wireless LAN provided by GSI. Send us your remarks, your questions, and use the hashtag. So I can find it on the iPad, and I may include it in the discussion. Thank you for your contribution. Let's start. Dr. Heiser, Asia is rising and its middle class is expanding. That really is a fact. And you say by 2030, it's estimated that Asia's middle class will represent 70% of the global middle class, which sounds enormous. To go right to the heart, will the middle class in Asia become development actor in a polycentric world? And if so, what kind of development actor will they likely become?
Thank you very much for this.
We have microphones for all of you.
So, Asia is indeed rising, and its middle class is expanding. And as I mentioned, it is estimated that by 2030, Asia's middle class will form almost 70% of the global middle class, and actually will also contribute to about 60% of middle class consumption. And this compared to about 30% of there being a part of the middle class in 2010, contributing about only 25% of global consumption. So in other words, it is growing and is growing very fast. So will they indeed be development actors? And if so, what type? It depends on how we unlock their development potential. And I would suggest that we need to look at it in 4 different ways. There are 4 possible ways in which the emerging middle class in Asia could indeed contribute to the type of development that we want. That is, a development that is inclusive, that is sustainable, and that is also resilient. And it depends, firstly, on whether the middle class can become the consumer class that can still become a new driver of growth. Especially at the time when Asia is shifting its development model, one from being factory Asia that is export-oriented to include a development model that is based on domestic consumption and regional consumption. So in Asia, there's a whole discussion on regional connectivity, on regional integration, and also in terms of how we manage our supply chains and the production systems that is related to the value chains. Now, it really depends on, if that is to happen, it really depends on whether Asia has indeed learned the lessons and can sustain the lessons of the Asian miracle, which means that we still need a developmental state that invests in job-led growth. We still depend on whether the state invests in building human capital, invests in the productive sectors, invest in the reallocation of labor from the less productive to the more productive sectors, and whether it can actually also address structural inequalities. Because Asia is developing, but unfortunately it is developing with increasing inequalities and unsustainability. So I will come back to that in the question time. So if we want to improve aggregate demand, we have to invest, again, in purchasing power, in household security, because whatever it is through wages that the middle class still develop income security. So it's a point 1. So it's not a done deal yet, because a lot of the labor in Asia is still linked, unfortunately, to factory Asia, and this is in a precarious situation. The second point is that the middle class can indeed become a catalyst for greater democracy, for addressing inequalities, and for addressing accountable governance, not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector. And this is largely because they are very much still a sandwich population, because the rising inequalities, the corruption, the inequalities have in fact affected their purchasing power and also affected the quality of what they seek. So their voice, the impact of representation, the way they seek to influence the decision-making in their countries that affect their life is something that they will take on. Especially at the time when they also see that we have moved Asia, whilst we are talking about the polycentric world, we have also, the middle class have also seen, or at least a subset of the middle class, have also seen that the state is being captured by corporate interests and captured by elite interests, and there's a possibility of corruption that will affect the emerging middle class. So, number 2. The third area in which the middle class could become a development actor is to act as a connected class. And this is because they are growing at the age of influence, where there are mobile phones, where there's social media. But the issue here is to what extent this connectedness will lead them to become global citizens with greater awareness, because they could be connected, but connected to virtual communities, and may, in fact, not be able to pick up on the realities and the situational analysis of what is really needed to look at the different power play, especially since a lot of the inequalities are developing along the traditional fault lines of gender, class, religion, ethnicity. And this is actually generating a lot of grievances in many of the new emerging countries. A very good example is what is now happening in Myanmar with the opening up of the country. The fourth issue that needs to be addressed is the whole issue of sustainability. We looked at the aggregate demand and the growing consumerism. But what type of demand? The nature of the demand. Currently, surveys have shown that a lot of the spending power has gone to cars, have gone to mobile phones, many people spend their leisure time shopping. So what is it? How do we ensure that the consumption pattern changes? And here, I think the combination of what is needed in terms of the connectivity between the middle class in the developing world and the developed world is absolutely critical. A very good example is actually ethical markets. How do we ensure that the new growth driver for sustainability actually emphasizes rights at work, not just the rights to work, and sustainability issues? How do we produce and consume? And this is absolutely critical. I think the world woke up with the Rana Plaza incident in Bangladesh when 1,138 government workers were literally buried alive because there were no rights at work. And because of the way garments were produced cheaply and rapidly for the world market, it woke everybody up. I think that if we can develop a global ethical market that emphasizes value, new values of equality and new values of sustainability, that is a way forward in terms of shared prosperity. And we need to look at equality, my final point, equality not just within countries, between countries, but across generation. And this is where the issue of sustainability is absolutely critical, because at the end of the day, even if we have a polycentric world, unfortunately or fortunately, we live in one world. And therefore, we have to find shared responsibility in order to make this world sustainable, not just for ourselves, but for the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Heiser, for this first intervention. Yes. You're very much welcome to applause for this very powerful setting. 4 different development roles. And I think there is a lot of things that could happen. What I keep from your intervention is that the preconditions are decisive in which this middle class will grow and emerge. And one central actor to is its state. The second thing is, what is the link between this sandwich population, you call it, to down and top, to poverty and to rich, so to say, to keep it simple. And the third thing is, how can we organize a global deal that is needed to make these effects positive of growing markets and growing middle classes? And let's go deeper into that. The link for me is to the political world. One thesis here is a catalyst for democracy and accountable governance. Professor Chen, you say middle class will not necessarily strike for democracy. I'm a journalist, so I'm tempering things a little bit, you know. I know that the world is not that simple that I'm providing to see it. But what is the link and the interest of growing middle classes, maybe at the example of China, into politics? What is it really they are interested in?
Okay.
Yes, simply use it and put it on the table. Yeah, that's fine. It's working.
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank EADI for the invitation for me to come to this forum, which is very important. I'm honored to be on the panel of other honorable colleagues. Okay, let me get to the point of the question. I would like to rephrase the question a little bit in the context of my most recent study of middle class in China. I would say I'm going to talk about the role, political role of the middle class in economic development or social economic development in general. In my field, which is political science, we often ask a question or several questions related to the political role of the middle class. One of the most important questions that we often ask is that does middle class support democracy or democratization, particularly in a late developing country, if you understand the definition of the late developing country or a late developing country. Basically, late developing countries are the developing countries or countries in the third world. So I also noticed at the beginning of this conference or this forum, people already use the term the new middle class or the new middle classes, plural term. First of all, I would like to say yes, the middle classes in the late developing countries are the new middle classes. They are different from the so-called old middle classes. Okay, if you still remember the Barrington Small's cliche statement, "No bourgeois, no democracy," so often you will come to the conclusion that democracy plays a positive role in shaping, promoting democracy in whatever country under whatever economic, social, political circumstances. By my finding, indicates actually middle classes, particularly in new developing countries, I should say late developing country or developing countries, do not necessarily support democracy or democratization. Okay. First of all, let me shed very brief light on the context of my study. This study was conducted in 2008. And the study was based on the survey data collected from 3 major Chinese cities, which represented 3 levels of economic development in this largest country, or most populous country. And so the findings indicate, from this study, we try to answer 3 specific questions related to the general question that I just posed. Does middle class support democracy, democratization? The first question is, does middle class in China really support democracy, democratization? And the second question is, why does or does not middle class support democracy or democratization in China? And the third question is, how does the middle class political attitude, which I'm going to talk about, impact their political role or political behavior? And finally, of course, we would like to draw a conclusion on the role of the middle class, particularly the implications of the middle class for the study of middle classes in late developing countries. So to answer the first question based on data, which I just mentioned, we conclude middle class in China does not support democracy. Later I can elaborate based on our data. Secondly, we have found the reasons that middle class does not support democracy in China. Mainly 2 reasons I would like to mention briefly. First of all, middle class in China is closely associated with the state. Is the state democratic state in China or the government? No. Okay. I think you can answer the question why the middle class does not support democracy since the state is not democratic state. Okay. And the second reason that our middle class does not support democracy is that middle class, basically in China, are the major beneficiaries from the policies made by the state. And the middle class in China was literally created by the state. So if you are created by the state, are you going to be opposed to the state? Okay, obviously not. Okay, and third reason is that most middle class members actually are associated with the state in terms of their employment. Over 60% of the middle class actually are state employees. Okay, if you're employed by the state, are you going to be opposed to the state? Okay, that's another reason. Okay, And the fourth reason is that, as I just mentioned, middle class actually have benefited from the major policies made by the state, and they're major economic beneficiaries. So if you get a benefit from the policies by the state, are you going to oppose the state? Okay, so obviously not. All right, so we draw the conclusion based on the empirical findings. The conclusion goes like this. Middle class in China does not support democracy, at least for the time being. And because middle class is so closely associated with the state, currently they are not pro-democracy. Okay? And of course, later we're going to talk about definition of democracy. I know you're interested in that. Okay? And finally, we would like to conclude that middle classes, I use the plural term, in late developing countries, their attitudes, their political attitudes, orientations, basically contingent upon their relationship with the state. So if you want to study political attitudes or their political orientations toward democracy or democratization, you have to look into their relationship with the state. That's our conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen. Can we keep the microphone for a minute? I would like to have an additional question. When I understand correctly, so you're saying that the main political concept of middle class is a kind of stability. They want to be sure that they keep their lifestyle. They won't provide it. They will protect it. Democracy, if that is a change concept, you have to go to democracy, so it's not an issue for them. Because what they want is stability. Is that the overall political setting in which we're talking about? So middle classes are, in general, not necessarily interested in change. They are interested in stability. And if the political concepts, whatever it is, provides that stability, so they keep with it. Is that mainly what they're saying?
Yes, this is very accurate reflection on our study. Yes, the middle class in China, at least, is very stability-oriented. Of course, if you have earned your lifestyle, which is better than the majority, still a majority of the population, of course, you want to keep the living style, lifestyle, and basically the current political setup or the political system pretty much, yes, very conducive to that kind of lifestyle.
Thank you very much for that clarification. I think that is something that on which you will earn a lot of comments and questions, and we're looking forward to that. Mr. Lopez Calva, we have been in Asia now, and I would like to have the perspective from Latin America, which is another part of the world where middle class and growing middle class in emerging countries is a very big issue. So from what Ms. Hazer and Mr. Chen have said, what can you pick up for the situation that you have in Latin America?
Thank you. Also, thank you for the invitation to this panel. The first thing that when we started, there are two reasons why we started looking into this issue. The first, when I was at UNDP, we were looking at measures of long-term success in terms of development, and we thought that one way to look at the long-term success was the size of the middle class in a society as an indicator of success in terms of policy and development. The second is that when I came to the World Bank, there was interest in looking at two things. One is poverty was decreasing in Latin America, and there was this idea by some colleagues that just because you are not poor, you become middle class, and it was somewhat counterintuitive. So we decided to really come up with a definition of middle class. So the first thing I would like to talk about is what we mean by middle class, because we're talking about middle class as if everybody knows what it means. It's like talking about happiness, and everybody has a different concept of happiness. So in terms of middle class, there are many ways in which we can define the middle class. And so we came up with this idea. It's not because we were looking for the right definition of the middle class, but we were looking for one definition of middle class that we could relate to. and that was useful for policy. So we proposed this idea of being middle class in the same way that we think about poverty in terms of some nutritional status. We thought, what was the functioning that defines the middle class? And we thought that economic security was the main issue defining the middle class, because a lot of the behaviors even that would relate to the middle class relate to this idea that you are not at risk of falling back into poverty. So basically we came up with this, so our definition of middle class first is defined in terms of that group in society that is less vulnerable to fall back into poverty. So, and we came up with a methodology to make this operational. So basically we look at those groups in society that are less likely to fall back into poverty, and that means that we have 4 groups in society, at least in the way we define it. So we have the poor, we have those that are not poor but that are not yet middle class, and then we have the middle class and the upper class. So that group that is not the middle class we call the vulnerable. And eventually this was picked up by other people, and you know, I understand Nancy Birzat will be talking here later in the conference, and she actually, with co-authors, also adopted this idea, and she called them the strugglers. So it's the same idea. We have basically the vulnerable, that are those who are not poor, but are not yet middle class. And this is very important, because for policy, at least in the case of Latin America, this is very important, because we have a lot of people that are not poor, but they are not middle class in the way we think about middle class. So there is a lot of policy, there is a very important role for policy in terms of strengthening this group in society so they become middle class. So this is the first thing I would like to bring to the conversation. What we mean by middle class, we have a very specific definition. So this idea of middle class defined in terms of vulnerability. The second issue is, once we define it, we look at the trends. And in the case of Latin America, it is very interesting, because in 2010, there is a historical shift, because the share of the population in Latin America that is middle class is larger, starting in 2009, 2010, even though there was a global crisis, is larger than the share of the population in poverty. So this is a historical shift. So the share of the population middle class becomes more important than that share of the population in poverty. So in the whole Latin America, about 28% are poor, but around 32% are middle class. So it becomes more important. But if we make this division in the way we define it, we say Latin America is not yet a middle class society, even though the middle class is growing, because if we divide it in the way we did it, actually the largest share of the population is still vulnerable. And this is very important. So Latin America is on the way to become a middle class society, but it's not yet a middle class society. And the largest share of the population in Latin America is vulnerable. So we need to deal with issues related to informality, we need to deal with issues related to fiscal inclusion, we need to deal with issues related to quality of service delivery. And we have seen demonstrations, by the way, recently in Brazil, related to quality of services, that the middle class is demanding quality, higher quality in terms of services. So in terms of the trends, this is the second point, is the middle class, yes, it has become very important in Latin America, but again, Latin America is not yet a middle class society, it's fundamentally a vulnerable society. And the third point, in a way, relates to what Professor Chen was saying, because then we look at some behavioral implications of middle classes. And we actually tend to agree with Professor Chen's conclusion, in the sense that in the case of Latin America, we look at the 2 surveys related to values. We define 7 categories of values related to democratic values, related to trust in institutions, related to tolerance for diversity, and so on. And we find, at least in terms of correlations, is that the middle class has not there is no middle class particularity in terms of values. Actually, what we find and we propose as a hypothesis is that the middle class is fundamentally pragmatic. So the middle class fundamentally will defend a political system that protects their standard of living. And we have seen historically in Latin America that middle classes actually have supported very undemocratic, non-democratic regimes, and have supported coup d'etats, and have supported important anti-democratic movements because it defends their standard of living. So basically what we say is that, yes, in political science, actually, since Aristotle, there is this discussion that the middle class is the backbone of democracy. But actually, what we find is that this is not the case. And actually, with this, I finish. In the last chapter of our report that was published in 2012 on middle classes in Latin America, we say that there is a potential, actually, a vicious circle or cycle in terms of middle classes, because as the quality of services is very low, middle classes opt out of the social contract and start demanding private services. So the middle classes in Latin America demand private education, demand private energy services, private security, a lot of the services that are supposed to be delivered by the state are demanded in private markets by the middle class. And then they have no incentives to contribute through the fiscal system. So there is a sort of a bad equilibrium in which you have fiscal weakness of the state, very low quality of services, and the middle class opting out of the social contract. And we see that as a problematic situation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lopez Calvas. Very interesting point, I think, and we now have 3 different approaches on middle classes. Your approach seems to me to be about behavior and consumption patterns and what they do and how they live. We have a political dimension of it, and now we have an economical dimension in it. And let's see what is the concept that fits. And maybe we can put this question to Mr. Desai. When you look at the Indian middle class or the situation in India, what is it in your experience or in your view the pattern that fits most for the self-understanding of middle class in India?
I would first of all like to thank EADI for inviting me here and for organizing such excellent weather. You know, when I spent 2 years in Germany in between 60 and 62 writing my thesis on real wages in Germany, it used to be cold, my goodness.
Oh, we improved much the weather situation in the northern part of the hemisphere. I mean, if you like it warm, yeah.
This is German technology. As you know, India is an old country, and everything in India is old, including the middle class. So we've had a middle class for centuries. We had traders trading between Egypt and Indonesia right for the last 2,000 years. And we had civil servants, government servants, thousands of them, collecting revenue from farmers and so on. So we've had a long history of the middle class. But the middle class had a rather rough time after independence. Democracy is, I'm afraid, not the best friend of the middle class. It was really the agricultural laborers, farmers, industrial workers, the poor, who had the majority and who elected the governments. The governments were all populist governments, which believed in high taxation and expenditure on public programs. And this was not to this, it didn't suit the middle class very well. And it led to one economic crisis after another. We had payments crises almost every 10 years. The last one was in 1991. I myself was a liberal economist, so I didn't have much to do in socialist India. So I wrote a lot of newspaper articles against the government. And I had a very good market, and I lived very well. And then suddenly, I was shocked to find one day that the finance minister, that the present prime minister, well, the last prime minister, Manmohan Singh, suddenly became finance minister. He called me up and said, "You have had a good enough time, you've served yourself long enough, it's time for you to serve your country." And he took me into the government, and I can tell you, I've never worked that long. I used to work 18 hours, and dealing with political pressures is hard work. And we did the reforms, we liberalized the economy, and the rate of economic growth, which until the 80s was 3.5%. We call it the Hindu rate of growth. It rose to about 6% from 91 till today. And national income has more than tripled, per capita income has more than doubled, and naturally, the middle class has expanded enormously. But the middle class has felt excluded because the middle class values have been excluded. The middle class would like free enterprise, competition, high growth, and these are things which the politicians never talked about, except for one politician, namely Narendra Modi, who has just become Prime Minister. And he not only talked about it, but he practiced it. Gujarat has the freest climate for investment in India. And as a result, it has had a consistently high rate of growth. For 10 years, over 10 years, it was 12% a year. So he comes with a great reputation and great expectations. Whether he'll fulfill them or not, we don't know. But because for now, the Indian economy is doing very badly, our rate of growth now is 4.5%, which we consider crazy. It is so low. It is half as high as 5 years ago. Whether he can revive the economy, this is the question. The more important question is what will drive the economy. In the 1970s, we had a very lucky accident, namely the Arab countries got annoyed with the Israelis and raised the price of oil from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel overnight and caused a world crisis, which was also a crisis for us because we import oil from the Arab countries, but it created an enormous boom in the Arab countries, which ran short of workers and started importing Indian workers. Today there are roughly 6 million Indian workers working just in Dubai. So it has been extremely good. The other factor has been the invention of PC, the personal computer, in 1978, which caused an enormous shortage of programmers, and the Americans started coming and taking away our scientists. And today we have probably about 2 million computer scientists, software scientists, working in Bangalore alone and many more outside. So these have been the drivers of the Indian economy, and these have been the creators of the modern Indian middle class. Whether we'll have another driver like this, I don't know. We must look for one, and we must look for growth, because growth is good for the middle class.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. So, I would like to look at Africa, which is supposed to create also, if I'm correct, the 300 million people growing into middle class over the next 10 years, something like that. I know that you are not an academic at first hand, you are an entrepreneur, but when you listen to the discussion, and you compare it with what you live in your country and your expertise in business, because your business is obviously providing a service for people that have access. I don't want to step into prejudices or stereotypes, but what you do is a service for people that have a minimum on benefits, that can buy medicine, that have a mobile phone, and so on and so on. So this is true for a lot of people in Africa on one hand. And when you look at the concept of middle class, is that something that fits also for a middle class in Ghana, or is that a complete different perspective and a complete different situation? What would you say?
So thank you. First of all, my congratulations to the organizers for a very well-organized conference. And it's true that I'm an entrepreneur now, but before I was an entrepreneur, I was a social activist, and I also still work with a policy activist organization. So I do have some, and obviously as a Tutu Fellow, I'm concerned about the general direction of African progress. But my approach to this subject will be, first of all, to question two fundamental assumptions that are implicit in the very categorization of the middle class, as has been evident from the first couple of submissions so far. And first, I will ask a few questions about the quantitative basis for the middle class discussion as far as Africa is concerned. Then I will move on to ask a few questions about the qualitative basis of the middle class discussion as well. Quantitatively, in the African context, you are right that one of the most credible organizations on the continent, the African Development Bank, suggests that the middle class is about 300 million, which would be more than 30% of the population, give or take a few couples of millions. There are other estimates. The challenge is that those estimates could range anywhere from a few million to 500 million, depending on how you look at the quantitative indicators they use. The African Development Bank, for instance, argue that a good way of categorizing the middle class would be to look at income measures, and those income measures are within the bound of $2 to $20. $2 to $20 is such a wide variation that it includes everything from peasant farmers all the way through cattle ranchers to people who are working in government offices in different parts of Africa. Obviously, cost of living varies widely across the continent. A bottle of Coke in Angola may suffice to provide somebody enough to live on in Gambia for the whole day. So wide variation of cost of living, as well as the fact that the quantitative range of income that is used to define who the middle class is, makes the concept essentially ridiculous. That is the first point. And it's therefore not surprising that when you look at estimates from different observers on the continent, you have anything from 5 million members of the middle class, as we've seen with some hedge funds that have done analysis in Africa, all the way to the 300 million that the African Development Bank has indicated. Even amongst development economists, the range is just too wide. From about 40 million that I have seen with, from estimates that the OECD have made, to 120 million that I've seen the World Bank at some point has postulated. So first of all, we really don't have a quantitative basis to make empirical observations as far as the middle class in Africa is concerned. We don't know how many there are, and we just not only do not know how many there are completely antagonistic ways of counting the middle class in Africa. On a qualitative basis, which is where I would dwell, we have even greater complexity in the sense that Africa is perhaps, and I think South Asia, so India, might be, but I'm not as familiar with India, so I'll stick to Africa, might be the only part of the world where you have not necessarily merely the fact that the middle class is heterogeneous, but that the middle class is actually conflicted. And by this I mean that because so many of the people who have made the most gains in income over the last couple of decades have tended to be in the trading class, most of whom have not acquired sufficient education to be considered literate on most of the standard indicators. Africa is one of the few places where you have small middle class people likely to be uneducated than middle class people who are educated. That's a fundamental difference in most parts of the world. Also, Africa is one of the few places where it is still not entirely clear that a standard 12-year education provides one with an assured income higher than a standard 6-year education, which is the case in most parts of Europe and Americans, empirically proven. So you have a lot of educated underclass, so many graduates of universities and 4-year or 2-year tertiary programs who are unemployed, and many of them underemployed to the point where they are living below the minimum wage. Such a significant proportion of the educated classes being economically disenfranchised and disempowered produces results that are completely conflictual as compared to other places where it tends to be the case that the economic middle class, the cultural middle class, and the political middle class tend to align. In Africa, not only do they not align, I will argue that very often their demands are in direct conflict. So rather than settle for the argument that my friend next to me has made, which is that it's heterogeneous, I'll argue that it's more than heterogeneous, that the middle class is actually, in most parts of Africa, internally conflicted, that there are competing demands that are not merely different perspectives of how they see the society, but ways in which you have irreconcilable differences of what the society should be aiming for. That is not merely a lack of homogeneity around values, it's around the very structures of the society and how the society should be organized. If you take that into consideration, this internal conflict within the middle class into consideration, then the discussion around the politics of it and how the middle class might be a development actor, in my view, becomes radically different. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simmons. I think we are really in the middle of the myths. And the good thing about Twitter is you do the job of the moderator. Isn't that great? The crowd always is more intelligent than one person. That's why I'm picking up a question from Twitter and not picking up my own question that I prepared last night, obviously. But the thing that several of you have mentioned in your first interventions here is exactly the question about the coherence of the concept of what we call the middle class. And I know that we can fill a lot of academic symposiums on that. I don't want to come to the question, and that is an open question to the panel to start a discussion about it. It's not what is a coherent middle class, or what is a coherent definition of a middle class. I would like to take it from a more practical perspective. When we look at the function of middle class, or the potential function of middle class in a developing process, do we need a coherent and unique global a definition of middle class? Yes or not? Do we need that definition, or is it sufficient to identify middle class relatively to the life environment they have? That is also exactly a question that comes from, what was it? Let me have a look. Yeah, it is about the contradiction of relatively and coherence. So do we need a coherent definition of middle class to deal with it? What would you say? Step in. Take a microphone and step in.
May I?
Yes, okay. Of course.
Yes, I do believe we need coherent or consistent conceptualization or concept of middle class.
Why is that?
Yes.
Why do we need that for the discussion?
Because in order to predict the role or explain the role of the middle class, we have to identify which group we're talking about in reality.
Okay.
If we have different definitions, then actually one theory or another might not be applicable. And our conversation or conversations might go passing each other. So we have to find a target first. Then we can talk about validity of each theoretical or political argument.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Maybe Mr. Hazen?
I would say that the middle class will always remain a diverse concept because there's so many different groups in it. And even among our countries, I mean, Asia itself, we talk about rising Asia, but Asia is so diverse. You have the economic powerhouses, you have the low-income countries, you have the middle-income countries, you have the low-middle-income countries. And what type of middle classes do we see emerging? It's actually a middle class that is emerging out of poverty. So many of the middle classes from Asia is not like, except maybe from India or a few other countries, but it's not really the old middle class. It's a new emerging middle class, and some of them are still at a precarious position. And also the point is that there is a new normal where they feel vulnerable. So uncertainty is part of the middle class as well. And this is both an opportunity as well as a challenge. And it's precisely because uncertainty is a new normal, because of the economic crisis, because of the natural disasters, because of the changing weather patterns. There are questions that are being raised. But not all, the middle class is not a coherent class that will raise it together. There are subsets of middle class that will take this on and lead a more, or be a much larger catalyst.
Okay, thank you. So you're saying that diversity is in it, but nevertheless we need some common ground to it. Where is that?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to have a meaningful discussion without a definition. And I think, so if we look at, the Bavarian tradition in terms of middle classes, there are three elements in it. One is the economic dimension, which is what he calls life chances. The second is the status or cultural consumption and so on, identity. And the third is the position of power. And these three elements have to do with middle classes. So what we do in our work is that we define, we isolate the economic dimension of it, which is the life chances part of it. And we define it in terms of vulnerability, as I said. So people who are vulnerable to fall back into poverty, even if they are not poor, they have certain behaviors in terms of cultural consumption, in terms of identity, in terms of the interaction to power, that are different from those who are more secure in terms of in economic terms. So what we propose is that if we believe that economic security is what defines middle class, then we have a concept that can change in terms of the context. So if you go from one country to another, you can have a different way in which you achieve that economic security. But the concept is the same. So the middle class are those basically that have this economic security, and then they behave in different ways. Now, this is an absolute definition of middle class, because there are also relative definitions of middle class, in which basically is your position in the income distribution, and then in every society, no matter how poor they are, there is a middle class because someone is in the middle. But that's a completely different type of analysis. So the idea here is that if we believe that middle class is important for economic growth, for economic stability, then we have to come up with a definition that tries to basically operationalize this idea.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Professor Chen. It's on.
It's on. Okay.
Yeah, it's always on.
Middle class is on. Okay. First of all, I would like to make a comment on the difference between coherence within the middle class and coherence of the definition of middle class. These are two different issues. First of all, I don't think a middle class or middle classes are really coherent. Okay, I agree with one of our speakers, Mr. Lopez Simpson. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. Yes, middle class is not coherent. You can find different segments of a middle class. According to our study, actually in China, you find at least 3 different segments of the middle class. They have different ideas. They share commonalities and also have differences in their political attitudes and behavior. And then, second question, should we have, again, come back to the original question our moderator just asked, should we have a coherent concept of the middle class? I still believe we need. Okay. Otherwise, how can we study the same group? How can we have a kind of a coherent discussion? Okay. So to answer this question, in our study, actually we use one indicator or measurement to identify middle class, which is we call objective measure. Okay, actually, for objective measures, there are 2 branches. One is kind of a qualitative objective measure. The other is a quantitative objective measure. We use a quantitative objective measure. To be brave, actually, we use occupation to identify middle class, because occupation is kind of a composite indicator of social group in different dimensions. So if you have that kind of occupation, then you must have that kind of education or income relatively in the middle relative to other groups in your area or country. So then this kind of indicator can be used across countries. Then we can use theoretical approaches to study the same middle class relatively in your own country, but of course we still refer to the same middle class in terms of their education, in terms of their lifestyle, and also in terms of their knowledge of their own professional operation.
Let's have first Mr. Simmons, please.
My view is quite more straightforward than I would have wished. I mean, it's a very complex subject. But the fact of the matter is that this is situated in a historical context. We are not operating in a context that is not steeped in a certain historical political dimension. We all know when the middle class became a force as far as history is concerned, it was gelled around reform. Most of the teams are deeply Marxian in origin. The idea of the middle class becoming a revolutionary vanguard is, in my view, the most coherent structuring of the concept. And it's been for that 100 years. Whether you are a Weberian in that view or you are a Marxist in that view, the truth of the matter is that the middle class is that part of the society that might be at the vanguard when it's changing. And you cannot have that if the fact of the matter, as in Africa, are such that there are multiple identities within that middle class umbrella which are fighting for supremacy. If you have, in our case in Africa, where whether somebody is educated or not, or whether somebody has high income or not, is so conflicting in what they position that person to want for the society, then you have an inherent conflict in the middle class concept. And I think you cannot go around it. It's fundamental to the way of conceptualizing it, in my view.
Thank you very much. Obviously, there is no agreed global concept of middle class, and there is a big job for you for the next 4 days and this conference, obviously. But when we go one step further, how can we then match the fact that the world is polycentric, and obviously we're talking about different phenomena in different contexts? Isn't that the case that we have a little bit too positive view on the role that these so-called middle class can play when we look at how differentiate their situation is? I mean, middle class is set here as a development driver. So how can they get this role when it's so differentiated and when we don't know exactly the group to address? How can that be? If
I may say something. So 3 points. One is, well, I agree that Marx talked a lot about the concept of class. And the notion we have in terms of class comes mainly from Marx's work. It's not clear that he really developed a concept of middle class. So it's not clear to me, at least. And, you know, the mix of the Marxian view with the Weberian view is what we have now in terms of the most traditional way of looking at the middle class, and Professor Cheng has talked about it in terms of looking at occupation as a way to measure middle class. However, when we look at some welfare indicator, like income or consumption, the distribution of this indicator within occupations, we see a huge overlap in terms of this distribution of this indicator, income or consumption, which it's very difficult for us then to talk about directional mobility. So we talk about middle class moving into a higher level of welfare. It's difficult to do it with the occupational definition, which is the most traditional way to look at class in sociology, because we have a very large overlap in terms of welfare notion. So that's why we came up with this idea of having an economic definition of middle class that would make sense. And this brings me to the final issue, which is it has to be relevant for policy, and this is why this is your point. I think we need to have a definition of middle class that brings elements in which we can act as a society in terms of policy and try to address issues related to middle class. One, in terms of, for example, strengthening the middle class by reducing vulnerability of certain groups that are not poor but are not yet in the middle class. But second, in terms of what you say, I mean, I think the agreement in this panel is that there is no such thing as the middle class being pro-democracy. Or, I mean, it seems that the research has shown that the middle class is pretty much pragmatic. So the idea here then is what are the variables that bring the middle class into a more cohesive social contract? And I think, and this is just a suggestion that we have in our report, is that the quality of public services that are delivered by the state is a key element to bring the middle classes back into the social contract. If the quality of public services is low, middle classes have no incentives to contribute to the provision of public services and have no incentives to use those services. And that it starts, splitting the society into conflicting groups.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Hazer?
I would say that the state plays a major role, precisely because a developmental state tries to raise their people out of poverty, but also increasingly precisely because there's a change in the development paradigm, especially in Asia, where it is shifting from export-based paradigm that was so much based on the concept and model of factory Asia that's based on cheap labor and relatively labor that was still very much precarious, to one where they need to build a middle class and to invest in the middle class precisely as a new driver of growth and increasing that aggregate demand in the country. So whether the middle class itself is a development actor or not, the fact is that the state is developing the middle class as a consumer class in order to drive growth. And the question here is whether they can do it by closing the existing development gaps, by investing further in education, as well as in healthcare, especially at a time when Asia is still weak, for example, in social protection systems. And therefore, the investment in job-led growth, especially at the time when wealth is being generated not through jobs, unfortunately, but through investment and speculation on assets. And here, I think, is a bit of is where the middle class itself becomes activated, precisely because they see that their position is not secure in a sense, precisely because the capture of the state through rising inequalities is a major concern, and therefore their purchasing power may not be able to buy what they actually had before. So, for example, in the stable or the miracle Asian economies, where there was the QE, most of the speculative capital came to Asia and created bubbles, and therefore it was impossible for the middle class to actually acquire the services that they had, including the housing, the transport, and so on. So it became extremely expensive. And precisely because of that, they became what I call the sandwich population. Because you'll have for example, the more developmental states would invest in responding to the poverty situation or to the poor. They are captured in a sense by elite interests in so many ways. But they cannot respond fully to the desires of the middle class. And that's where the middle class becomes activated and take on the pressures through the voting system. That's why democracy, for me, is actually developing in terms of the subsets of the middle class, because they need to hold the state and the corporate sector accountable.
Thank you very much. That is the concept of intervention, how a state is dealing with this part of the population. How can they make it grow? But when I look at the tweets you sent me, and I would like to open up the debate a little bit with you, some remarks are really kind of frustrating. One lady is saying here, middle class are not graduated poor, they are stuck in the middle of nothing in most cases, which is a very depressive description of middle class somehow. But nevertheless, we had this discussion about they are in a sandwich position. We have to keep them out of poverty. Yes, the strugglers you mentioned, but what is the perspective really? And you come with the intervention of state. And another participant is saying, when are you a development actor? Is the middle class not such intentionally or unintentionally to consumption, etc.? So one idea also is the middle class doing at the end of the day something that it's doing, and this is providing for economical growth as such, and is a development actor? Can we leave it at this point? That seems to me two different ideas that are really relevant for this discussion. A third point that I wanted to mention is how can we bring together the fact that middle class is growing and market demand is growing, and at the same time we have that workers that we have in Dubai, you mentioned, for instance. So where is the human rights and equality perspective in it? So maybe one very short answer by one or two of you. Is there a value issue, a political, a human rights issue that we need to address to make sure that the concept of middle class and its provision for development is not purely an economical factor or something like that? Less or not? Mr. Chen. Very short answer, please.
Sure, very short. I don't think a middle class is inherently pro-human rights. That's my general position. Okay.
Yes.
You want me to elaborate a little bit?
The question was, and we had this morning, I think, the deal between the social deal, the social contract we maybe need, because we have been hearing about very different effects of growing economies and growing middle classes. Mr. Desai, maybe.
If we really want to talk of the middle class as an actor, we have to define it more closely. The economists tend to define it in terms of income distribution. They say it is between anyone whose income is between $4 and $10 per month, PPP 2005, is middle class. I find this pretty useless because there is no unity to this class. And you can't really think of this class as an actor. I find it more useful, even though I'm an economist, to think of this sociologically and to distinguish between what are we distinguishing the middle class from. We are really distinguishing it from what was at one time called the working class. And nowadays we talk of the poor. And the difference is that the middle class has aspirations, has ambitions, has a desire to change, to improve things. And this is something that you cannot have if people are too poor. And the question is, how can you connect the society, redesign the society, so as to give this hope to the entire spectrum? I'll tell you a story. Last week I took a taxi in Delhi, and the taxi driver looked very well dressed. So I said to him, how is a man like you driving a taxi? So he said, I come from the Himalayas, and I used to buy shawls made in my village and sell them all over India. Then one customer didn't pay me about 30,000 euros, and so I went bankrupt, and so I had to drive a taxi. Now this man was middle class one day and a poor man the next day. And this is this continuum that we need to study and to encourage, actually. We really want to make the entire society middle class.
If I may.
Thank you.
precisely what Mr.
Short
Desai is saying.
reply
yes,
to that? Okay.
Is totally consistent with our proposal in terms of the vulnerability idea of middle class. What he's saying is those who are vulnerable cannot be middle class. I don't know which documents he read, but the 4 to 10 threshold is precisely what we call the vulnerable. The middle class is from 10 to 50, and it's much more homogeneous than those from $4 to $10 PPP per capita, which are actually the vulnerable and are pretty much heterogeneous. And final point is, yes, the same way that we talk about poverty reduction through targeting, we have to talk about middle class strengthening through universal provision of quality services. I think the quality provision of the provision of quality services in a universal basis is what strengthens eventually in the long term the middle class.
I was referring to Homi Kharas of the World Bank.
Let us open up to the debate, and you can make your point. I think that's not a problem. So, apart from the questions via Twitter, so is there other questions or remarks? Please use a microphone. Do we have somebody that turns around with a microphone? Okay, I will do that job for you. So, please say briefly your name and do me a favor. Step away from these kind of co-keynotes, if you are able to, and keep your keynotes and co-keynotes for other panel sessions, okay? Thank you. So,
thank you very much.
Stop. I will switch it on for you. I'm my own technician here. So, should work.
Thank you. Yes. I wonder if one could slightly modify Mr. Lopez Calvo's definition in view of Dr. Desai's first sentence, which was that the middle class in India was 2,000 years old. I think that's an important perception. I'm not sure that anyone who has been poor ever ceases to be vulnerable. In other words, do we need to go to the second generation? Is the idea of a new middle class, in a sense, a contradiction in terms? A middle class has to be secure in itself and to have only known security. So that, I mean, if one looks at the history of Germany or the UK, it was in the second generation and the third generation after the Industrial Revolution that the middle class, in the sense in which we all note it, in the Piketty sense, if you like, comes into play. So are we actually looking too soon for, and this sort of middle, and it's only once you have this security that you, in a sense, have the ability to look at others and therefore to have a development role other than the purely consumer.
Thank you very much. So the question goes in the direction, now we're talking about a long-term process, and at what stage are we looking at it, and are we over-demanding for the respective people at the stage they are? Interesting question. Let's collect some more and then go to answer. Keep your question in mind, please. So, raising hand there. Yes, Hans. It's difficult for me to come to you.
Okay, my name is Hans Dembowski. I'm the editor of D+C, and I would like to ask a question concerning human rights and the middle classes. Now, Dr. Shen, you said that basically the middle classes benefit from the state, and that's why they support the state. That is true so long as the state is the main source of power and income in a society. As soon as you have a vibrant stock market, if you have lively universities, as soon as the courts start to matter, the middle classes need freedom of speech. Because without freedom of speech, you have no academic discourse. You have no argument over the rule of law. I'm not saying the rule of law yet, but the argument over the rule of law. And most importantly, it is impossible to have a transparent stock market without a free press. So there's a very tight link between human rights and a thriving middle class, not a subservient middle class. When do you think that will be the case? When will China come to the point, the tipping point, where the middle class needs this kind of freedom of speech?
I had two questions, one for Professor Chen. you talked about the middle class being steered very much by the government. And a recent document of the government talks about promoting the low-carbon life and low-carbon days amongst the middle class. So do you think that's really going to work? Do you think that the state can also create a new human being in terms of consumption patterns in China, if it wants to? I'm curious about how that works. And for Professor Desai, Dr. Desai, you were talking about middle-class values. I have a feeling that India is a fairly heterogeneous country, so the values would also be very heterogeneous. And I was quite curious to know how you see those values in terms of, for example, the right to civic amenities, which we heard from you when you were talking about Latin America, that the middle class doesn't want to pay taxes for civic amenities and they want to privatize everything. Is that a big risk for India? And can the middle class also try to push for the availability of civic amenities, not only for the middle class, but for everybody living with the middle class in cities, for example, in India?
Thank you very much. Maybe one more question from behind. Can you hand over the microphone to me, please?
Thank you very much. I'm Franklin Lisk from the University of Warwick in the UK, and I am from Sierra Leone. I want to look at the middle class in the context of Africa. Quite correctly, as Mr. Simon said, the African Development Bank has staked its considerable prestige on the importance of the middle class to drive growth, rapid growth, and sustainable development. Now, when one looks at the middle class in Africa, and I'm not going into numbers and definitions or even the qualitative differences, but just take them as a group, as perceived by the bank and others who are pushing this view of the middle class as the dynamic driver of growth, I think we should look at two dimensions. The first is the issue of whether the middle class is a creator of wealth, and also this wealth is penetrated within the wider economy so that it impacts on poverty reduction. I think this is important. Or is the middle class just a consuming class that is contributing to consumption of imported goods which are not produced internally and which do not add any value to Africa's productive capacity? And the second is precisely this productive capacity. Does the middle class, by its behavior and its action, contribute to productivity enhancement? Because I think this is very important for the purpose of industrial upgrading, which in fact would be the critical factor in economic transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's turn for a first round to the panel, and then it's again your time. So, the first question we had here about the long-term or the generation aspect of a middle class we're talking about. Who feels, I don't know exactly, who feels competent to step in?
Yes, quick
Mr. Lopez Calvas. You are obviously all competent, but one must decide. I want to avoid that we have 5 answers to one question now. Okay.
No, I was thinking that, Groucho Marx said that the main cause of divorce is marriage. And I think if we want to, this idea of, looking at correlations as causes is very typical. And if we want to rely on a tautology and say that middle classes are those that behave in a certain way, it's a tautology. The thing is what makes them behave in a certain way. And it may take time. It may take generations. But the idea is what is the driving force? And we believe that this economic security and this achieving certain level of welfare makes you behave in a different way. And that is why I think a lot of the discussion should be based on this idea of whether we accept one or another definition of middle class. So if we want to look at the actual cause of why people behave in a different way, then we believe that is this economic security idea. Now, if you want to define middle class in terms of how they behave, then it's a tautology, because then anybody that doesn't behave in that way is not middle class, and that's it.
Okay, Professor Chen.
Okay, I would like to make some comments on this question, particularly on new versus old middle classes. At least in political science, so we define a new vis-a-vis old middle class, not by generation, actually by the context, okay, social political context. We consider old middle class to be those or a socio-economic group in the early industrialized country. Okay, and then we define a new middle class actually to be in late developing countries. They don't have a kind of a connection in terms of the generation. Okay, but of course they do share some commonalities. But here we emphasize the differences between these two kinds of middle classes. In my opinion, we have to look at these two kinds of middle classes by one very important indicator, which is autonomy. Okay, old middle classes, according to our study, actually emerged a long time ago out of the conflict between this social class and the state. But new middle class actually emerged recently, not only in terms of the time, but also in terms of the relationship between the state and the middle class. In other words, new middle class is not as autonomous as the old middle class in terms of the relationship. It's a relationship with the state. In other words, I would like to say new middle class or new middle classes in general are dependent upon the state. Mm-hmm. So that's why we have a different, that's why we see the difference in their political attitudes. That's why we have the different prediction of their political role in social economic development.
Thank you very much. There was this other question regarding freedom put forward by Hans. Mr. Simmons?
I have a statement which might, encompass a number of responses to different questions that have already been asked. And it goes back to, what an implicit debate between Mr. Lopez and a couple of the speakers. The truth is that one easy way of looking at this very closely is to take extreme situations. Take, for instance, a context where there is either pervasive crime or a context where there is pervasive conflict. So let's say the bootleggers and the pirates in the South China Sea as a community. Or let's say conflict mines in the Congo as a community. You will find that depending on certain drivers, income may rise very fast over a period of, say, 100 years. The difference between the behavior of certain pirates in the South China Sea, though, and to give an example, monks who give a vow of poverty in Ireland and create communities in Ireland, the big difference between those two is whether one is a vanguard of a society with clear views of how that society should be run, and that are just simply trying to survive. You cannot, in those kind of two contexts, where you look at those extremes, conflict societies or areas where there's pervasive crime, and because of that as a driver of income and even welfare. And contextualizing that with, say, monk or religious communities where income is dropping at the same time as the fervor for transformation. If you look at those extreme situations, it becomes obvious to you that income drivers are a very dangerous way of categorizing the middle class. And that goes back to the point the gentleman was making, whether the gentleman from Sierra Leone, whether simply a rise in consumption becoming, being parameterized along the same axis as a rise in income is a good way of looking at the middle class, when in a lot of those situations, what has arisen is general fiscal fragility of the whole community. So we have to be very careful.
Thank you very much.
I would actually also address the issue of changing consciousness and changing values and the values of the middle class. Because at the end of the day, there is a core set of ethics that the middle class has also developed. And there are certain things, precisely because of their security, they are able to acquire through education, through engagement, through greater exposure, through being a more connected class. And when that's under threat, they value certain things, which is freedom, which is choice, which is quality, and it's no longer just the rate of development. I think people are already looking at the quality of development. How do you produce? How are different communities being affected? And I think that in a sense, allows at least a certain subset of the middle class to take risks, and the risk to push us beyond certain boundaries, or else we're not going to have the transformation that is needed to bring us to a more equitable and a more sustainable society. So the extent to which that security actually allows risk-taking in the middle class is absolutely critical. And this could be something that allows them to see themselves not just in the middle class within nation-state boundaries, but more as global citizenship. And I think that shared value is where we begin to actually look, or we need to look about if we are to build on the transformations that are needed to bring us beyond the 2015 development agenda.
Mm. I would support this. I agree. I certainly note that in the Indian middle class, there is a certain deficiency of social conscience. I very often go to Calcutta, and I find extremely poor people. I find people on the streets who very often don't have enough clothes even. And it's very interesting, when I give them money, they don't know what to do with it. They either ignore me or they are surprised, which means to me that others don't give money that easily. And this is something, well, it sort of varies across India. People in some places are more generous than elsewhere. But there is a certain deficiency of social conscience. And I would say that it's not the middle, well, if you just look at the facts, then it's not the middle class which generates growth. It is the entrepreneurial class, the Schumpeterian class, which generates growth. What the middle class does, certainly in India and China, is to save. They save a lot of money. India has a savings rate of what, 30%, 35%. China has something like 50%. This is due to the middle class. It's not due to the poor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Desai. I would like to take that as a kind of final word, because we have come to the end of that discussion. When I looked to the tweets you sent, thank you very much for engaging in that lively debate. You can see that on your Twitter account, all the remarks, when you type the hashtag, if you have a Twitter account. So follow on it. One interesting remark that I would like to mention, and another one as well. One was due to the political situation and the political interest. Chen is right, but they can do politics within the state. Example, given demand, decentralization or services was one idea that came up regarding the political. When we have not talked about the concept of an actor. What is an actor? What is an actor doing? But we have talked about the political interests of middle class, and we have been stuck a little bit in the discussion, saying they are most pragmatic. And here are some remarks that goes a little bit beyond that. Another one was, does the conflictual nature of the African middle class have to do with their growth rather than their emergency out of poverty? That also is a very tricky question, I think, and it leads to the question you have: middle class as a consumption class or as a productive class? What is the benchmark for the poverty discussion, and so on? So, thank you very much for your contribution to that first serve for a 4-day conference in which you will intensify these discussions about several aspects. Please give us a big applause for our decisive panel. Dr. Ashok Desai, Dr. Nolene Hazer, Professor Chi Chen, Mr. Lopez Galva, and Mr. Bright Simmons. Thank you very much. Enjoy the coffee break and enjoy further discussions. I wish you good luck to sort out the remaining questions. Thank you very much.